All right, it's Thursday, March 14th. We continue our series on the Cold War. In fact, we get very near the end. Things are going to be coming due very soon. Just to give you an update as to what to expect between now and the end of the year, there are two remaining turn-in dates. One of them is Wednesday, May 20th, and the other is Friday, May 29th. On Wednesday, May 20th, that is a week from yesterday, Wednesday, May 20th, Quiz 23 will be due. The question for Quiz 23 is, how did the Cold War end? Once again, I'm giving you a lot of latitude as to what that means. You can discuss the actual circumstances, you can discuss the causes, whatever you would like to do, but I want 100 words as to why the Cold War, or how did the Cold War end. Please email it to me or submit it in the packet that's distributed on Wednesday, May 20th. If you choose to email it, you have till midnight of Wednesday, May 20th. It is open notes, open book, open video, no working together. Your work should be entirely your own and no one else's. No plagiarism. So no direct copying. You can integrate ideas, but you cannot restate them. All right. I think by this time most of you are aware of what to expect. As a farther reminder, Friday, May 29th, expect Quiz 24 and Test 8. But I will do classes this week and I will do classes next week. But after next Friday, which I believe that will be the 22nd, I believe, that will be my last video. And then you'll have an entire week, that final week, to do the necessary work to submit. Continuing the Cold War, we've discussed the major players. We've discussed the United States. We've discussed the Soviet Union. Now let's move into some of the ancillary players. Japan after World War II was a unique story of success, brought largely by the Japanese people, but they were certainly supported and carried by the United States. The United States invested heavily in Japan. General Douglas MacArthur was the military dictator after the war. He was very successful in this task. Now, I've been pretty hard on him in other places, and I think rightfully so, deservedly so. But his skill as an administrator in Japan after World War II was an unqualified success. He did quite a bit of good work to restore society and to build on something. By 1951, the United States signed a treaty with the new Japanese government, and by 1952, the occupation ended. So in 1952, troops were no longer unwillingly stationed in Japan. Now, they would still be there for quite some time, but it would be there at the invitation of the Japanese government. There was a particular Prime Minister Yoshida, believed that Japan would succeed if it tied itself to the United States and devoted itself to economic growth. So in the past, Japan had devoted itself to military power. Remember when Commodore Perry entered Japan, they came to the startling conclusion that they were centuries behind in the art of warfare, and so they took on Western practices, but primarily for the purpose of fighting. Now they took it on primarily for the purpose of making things and building things. Japan saw massive growth in all sectors, and quality control in Japan became legendary. So made in Japan meant something that was well built, something that would last. By 1968, Japan had become the world's second largest economy. That continued all the way into the 80s, and then in the 1990s, we'll deal with that later on, Japan hit a significant era of stagnation, which quite honestly, they have yet to leave. Great Britain had seen a number of changes since the end of World War II. It was immediately apparent that the days of the British Empire were over. After World War I, Great Britain maintained its desire to have world influence and in fact was successful. But at the end of World War II, there was really nothing left. There was no even attempt to maintain that empire because it was just too expensive and Britain had exhausted itself in its own survival. The remaining colonies became independent over the course of the next several decades. Chief among them was India, which achieved independence under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi relatively quickly. Great Britain had gone through major changes as well, not only in the sense of the empire, but also in terms of the nation at home. Post-war austerity drove the people to move in a new direction politically. During the war and immediately after the war, the people of Great Britain had discovered what want was like. There was not enough food, there was not enough goods, there was not enough supplies, and it was all rationed, and people were tired of that. So Clement Attlee led the Labour Party to victory before the war had ended. Now, keep in mind what that meant, that literally Great Britain tossed Winston Churchill out of office before World War II was concluded. And keep in mind, Winston Churchill was the man who carried Great Britain through the war. If it sounds ungrateful, well, sometimes politics is ungrateful. Later on, Churchill returned the to the premiership, but he was not able to see the end of the war. Attlee brought with him the idea of cradle to the grave. He was going to create a system in which the government cared for the people. Not quite socialism, but not necessarily that far from it. So because of this, Britain nationalized a number of key industries. Now, most people today point to the nationalization of British industries, especially healthcare, and say, what a rousing success. That's the entirely wrong, I think, conclusion to draw from it. Back in 1949, 1950, all the way in the 1950s to the end, Great Britain had one of the greatest industries when it came to automobile industry and aviation industry. Britain produced wonderful airplanes. The Lightning was as good as anything in America. The Canberra bomber was so good that America just straight bought it. The automobiles, whether it was the Spitfire and the Triumph and various things, were excellent. And then they became nationalized, and the quality went downhill until eventually, by the 70s, it was absolute trash. At one point, Britain had these tremendous industries, but they continued to decline until there was just nothing left. And so by the 70s, British industry had become a stagnant joke. Strikes were common, quality was unbelievably poor, new ideas were gone, inefficiency was rampant. It was just a disaster. Now, in favor of Great Britain, Queen Elizabeth took over for her father when he passed away. She was a very popular monarch, continues to be even to this day. She inspires confidence and stability. Great Britain was helped by the Marshall Plan. In fact, of all the nations that received goods from America, Great Britain was the chief. Britain, by the end of the 1950s, by early 1950s, had the highest living standard in Europe. And then, as I mentioned, all the nationalism took place, all the nationalizing of the industries took place, and so by the 1970s, Great Britain had one of the lowest living standards in Europe. I'm emphasizing this as to prove a point that when the government took over all these industries, it did not make for a better Great Britain, and it did not make for a happier, more stable, prosperous people. It actually did the opposite. Socialism had profoundly changed Great Britain in a lot of negative ways. By 1979, Great Britain elected a new prime minister, a conservative, rather shocking. It was a woman. Her name was Margaret Thatcher, or as she became known, the Iron Lady. She became prime minister, and she was quite a leader. In fact, she was the most significant prime minister of Great Britain, except for Winston Churchill, in the last really 150 years, 100 years, because then you get back to Gladstone and Disraeli. But she follows the pattern of consequential, important, significant, thoughtful English prime ministers that have, in some ways, delivered England. She inherited a nation with severe problems, including North Ireland. North Ireland has maintained its allegiance to the United Kingdom, while Ireland is its own nation. This led to what was called the Troubles, a lot of terrorism domestically and even within England itself. It led to high unemployment. Not led to. She inherited high unemployment. She inherited industrial inefficiency. It was comical how badly British industry tried to do simple tasks. And then she also had to deal with the Falklands. The Falklands are a small island chain several hundred miles off the coast of Argentina, which are part of Great Britain. They're Great Britain's possessions, and the people who live there wish to continue to be part of Great Britain. And in the 80s, Argentina, which was going through a severe economic downturn, tried to distract its own people from their problems, and so they tried conquering the Falklands. And Great Britain fought Argentina in the early 1980s, and Great Britain defeated Argentina. And Margaret Thatcher took the lead there. She made the hard calls, and it was a stunning triumph for her and for the nation. She successfully brought a new era of prosperity. England saw a revitalization in many ways. She partnered with Ronald Reagan in ending the Cold War. In fact, you can say, really, during the Reagan era, Margaret Thatcher was probably the second most important person in the world. She was friends with Reagan. They respected each other, and Reagan would listen to her. And so because of that, she was able to actually shape world policy. And she contributed very much. She had a deep hatred for communism and a deep belief in freedom, maybe not to the extent that an American sees freedom, but she did quite well, and she was a significant person within her own. The Middle East during this time became a major concern. The presence of vast reserves of oil, which was now essential for the world economy, was discovered. And so what happened almost overnight is several insignificant tribes, I think specifically of the House of Saud, became significant. So the House of Saud becomes Saudi Arabia, and what had been poor nomads of the desert become filthy rich sheiks and emirs and other leaders in the Middle East. Now, to compound that problem, we see the creation of the nation of Israel in 1948. For generations, the area Palestine had been administered by Great Britain. There had never been a nation called Palestine. It was just the regional name that Britain had used since it had been called Palestine for the last 1,000 years. Back in 1917, Britain issued what was called the Balfour Declaration, which promised the Jewish people a homeland. In Israel, 1948, Britain in 48 finally was able to administer that, and so Israel was formed. It was given, the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people was given back to them. Now, this created an immediate clash because there were already people living on those lands. There were Arabs that were there. Now, when the Israelis arrived, the offer was anyone who was inside the territory that was now called Israel was free to join the nation. It was not exclusively, and to this day is not exclusively, Jewish. If you were an Arab in Israel, you became an Israeli and received all the rights and privileges that were there. The surrounding Arab nations, unfortunately, not unfortunately, evilly, lied to these people. They told them the Jews were coming to slaughter them, and they also told them that you are not allowed to come to our nation, which led to a massive refugee crisis, which exists to this day. The refugee crisis did not need to exist. There was two options. The people could have stayed in their homes. If they had of, incidentally, they would be citizens of the nation of Israel, and there are no Arabs that are as free in the Middle East as Israeli citizens. Nobody has more freedom than Israelis. Or they could have traveled to other nations like Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and joined those nations. Unfortunately, the leaders of those nations refused to receive them. So the current Palestinian refugee crisis is largely created by the surrounding nations who both caused panic and then refused to help. So that problem has continued. As soon as the Israeli nation was born, they were attacked by the surrounding Arab nations. The Israelis were able to successfully fight off the attack. There have been several wars since, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. Each of them were an attempt by the Arab neighbors to drive the Israelis into the sea and destroy them. Each of them have ended in failure for the Arabs and success for Israel. Gradually, there's been a rather begrudging, not formal, but at least tacit acknowledgement that Israel is here to stay, because Israel is now recognized as a premier fighting force. Israel's military is among the best in the world. In fact, they use top-end equipment. This is a photo of the Israeli Air Force, and they are part of the, you can see on the left, that is the F-35 Lightning II, developed by the United States. It's one of the most advanced fighters in the world, and the Israelis participated in its development, and they've bought it. And there is a variation of what is the F-16 Fighting Falcon, another American plane that the Israelis have extensively developed. It is a very formidable machine that they've done with extra fuel and various other things that they've done. All that is to say, Israel's strong and powerful, and it's not going anywhere. And all this started and took place during the Cold War. All right, in the days ahead, we are going to look at what we might call the final chapter, which is the present. And so I trust that you will begin working on the quiz, and I trust that you'll be continuing to watch the videos, and then we will get to these this last essentially week and a half, and you'll be done with history for the year. Thank you.